In a period marked by unprecedented domestic political upheaval and escalating international tensions, the United States finds itself navigating a perilous landscape where the very foundations of its democratic institutions are being tested even as the specter of direct military confrontation looms large. Recent reports paint a stark picture of a presidency accelerating its trajectory towards authoritarianism at home while seemingly pushing the envelope on military engagement abroad, raising profound questions about the nation's future stability. The Guardian in a recent report highlights a truly alarming speed at which the Trump administration is propelling the U.S. into authoritarianism. Experts are voicing deep concern over what they describe as an authoritarian assault on institutions and constitutionally guaranteed freedoms of expression. The catalog of actions reads like a chilling blueprint for autocracy: the handcuffing and arrest of opposition politicians, including U.S. Senator Alex Padilla, for merely questioning authority, the arrest of a judge in her own courthouse, and the deployment of masked snatch squads to detain individuals in public, a tactic critics say is designed to provoke widespread fear. Adding to these concerns, a senior presidential aide has reportedly announced the potential suspension of habeas corpus, a cornerstone legal defense. Stephen Levitsky, a Harvard political scientist and co-author of How Democracies Die, observed that Trump is throwing authoritarian punches at a much greater rate than any of these other cases in their first year in power. Eric Rubin, a former U.S. ambassador, went further, stating that Trump is going faster than Putin even came close to going in terms of gradually eliminating democratic institutions and democratic freedoms, noting that Russia's shift took years, while the U.S. appears to be witnessing a rapid descent within months. The erosion of democratic norms is quantitatively reflected in recent data. Brightline Watch, a survey of political scientists, recently assigned the U.S. a score of 53 on a spectrum where 0 signifies total dictatorship and 100 denotes a perfect democracy, the lowest score since data collection began in 2017. Brendan Nyhan, a Dartmouth College professor involved in the study, noted that this places the U.S. in the range of countries like Brazil and Israel, with academics forecasting a further decline to 48 by 2027. A critical factor in whether this authoritarian tilt becomes decisive, according to Levitsky, is the administration's efforts to assert control over the armed forces. He warned that the only way that you can get from where we are to real authoritarianism like Nicaragua or Venezuela or Russia is if Trump has the military and security forces on his side. The controversial deployment of 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 active Marines to Los Angeles against anti-migrant protesters despite opposition from California Governor Gavin Newsom is seen as a significant step in this direction, aiming to establish a legal precedent for presidential military deployment over state authority. This was further underscored by a military parade in Washington ostensibly for the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary but coincidentally held on the president's 79th birthday. Drawing comparisons to autocratic regimes and fueling concerns of the military being turned into a personal tool, the climate of political tension has regrettably escalated to violence. While a massive No Kings protest in Washington saw no clashes with government forces, sporadic violence was reported elsewhere, including a man driving his car through a crowd of protesters in Northern Virginia. More gravely, Democratic state legislator Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot dead in Minnesota in what police are investigating as a targeted political assassination, allegedly by a Christian nationalist Trump supporter who reportedly had a list of over 45 Democratic targets. Eric Rubin likened the resulting climate of fear to Weimar Germany before the rise of Hitler, warning that such intimidation could deter individuals from public service. Analysts also point to the administration's aggressive expansion of presidential powers through the declaration of emergencies, a tactic that, as Levitsky explains, allows the circumvention of constitutional constraints. The Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority and a history of rulings favorable to the president, is viewed by some as an insufficient democratic safeguard, particularly after a ruling last year that effectively granted the president vast prosecutorial immunity for acts committed in office. Kim Lane Skepely, a Princeton professor, warned, "We're a few Supreme Court decisions away from having a president we can't get rid of." This aggressive assertion of executive power is not confined to the domestic arena, it extends with potentially grave consequences to the realm of foreign policy, particularly concerning the volatile Middle East. Reports from Axios indicate that President Trump has been actively pressing aides on the feasibility and effectiveness of a bunker-buster plan to bomb Iran. This comes as Reuters highlights a significant shift in Trump's foreign policy. Noting how the self-proclaimed peacemaker has embraced Israel's campaign against Iran. The heightened tensions manifest in direct military action, with the Washington Post reporting an Iranian strike hitting a key hospital in southern Israel. The contemplation of a U.S. bunker-buster strike coupled with an already escalating regional conflict signals a perilous trajectory, suggesting a willingness to resort to military solutions even as domestic institutions face unprecedented strain. As the nation grapples with these converging crises, the road ahead remains uncertain. David, from an anti-Trump conservative commentator, raised concerns in The Atlantic that the administration's penchant for declaring emergencies could extend to next year's congressional elections, potentially subverting their integrity. Even if the president were to face an election setback, the prospect of accountability remains challenging. As Brendan Nyhan noted, that the current political system makes impeachment and removal by Congress a seemingly impossible task. The confluence of rapid democratic erosion at home and a highly volatile, potentially explosive foreign policy approach suggests a period of profound instability. The coming months, particularly leading into the midterms, will be critical in determining whether the checks and balances of American democracy can withstand the current pressures and what further escalations might unfold on the global stage. In an era increasingly defined by the intersection of politics, technology, and global economics, the actions and rhetoric emanating from the White House continue to shape domestic landscapes and international relations with unprecedented speed and impact. From the president's direct digital pronouncements to the sweeping implications of his trade policies and the administration's framing of civil unrest, a complex web of events is unfolding, testing established norms and drawing sharp contrasts between official narratives and ground realities. One of the most persistent concerns revolves around the president's distinctive use of social media, particularly in moments of high international tension. As an opinion piece in USA Today highlighted on June 19, 2025, President Trump's constantly dropped comments on social media outrage progressives, baffle journalists, and confuse everyone else. This stream of consciousness communication style, likened by columnist Nicole Russell to an NBA point guard taunting foes, is deemed cringeworthy and dangerous in a world where wars are a constant threat. Russell specifically cited a June 17 Truth Social post where Trump openly speculated on the location of Iran's supreme leader, stating he is an easy target but is safe there. "We are not going to take him out, kill. At least not for now." Such remarks, alongside his casual dismissal of potential missile strikes as a casual game of checkers, raise serious questions about the decorum and strategic implications of presidential communication, especially as the world watches for potential U.S. involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict. The article further recalled a May post describing Russian President Vladimir Putin as absolutely crazy, even as the U.S. was attempting to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine, underscoring the perceived haphazardness that critics argue undermines diplomatic efforts. Simultaneously, the administration's economic policies, particularly its aggressive stance on tariffs, are reverberating across global markets and domestic industries. Following the G7 summit, President Trump secured a limited trade deal with the United Kingdom which lowers tariffs on British car and aerospace imports. However, as Yahoo Finance reported on June 19, 2025, the president hinted at significant roadblocks elsewhere. Describing Japan as tough in trade talks and expressing dissatisfaction with the European Union's offers. The EU, according to sources, is now bracing for a 10% reciprocal tariff as a starting point in any US-EU deal, with the Financial Times reporting their pursuit of a UK-style agreement to mitigate further retaliation ahead of the looming July 9 Liberation Day tariff deadline. The economic fallout is already palpable. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell noted that the substantially larger tariffs are raising inflation expectations, with the Fed's preferred inflation measure, core personal consumption expenditures for 2025, moving higher. Powell admitted that pass-through of tariffs to consumer price inflation is a whole process that's very uncertain, as various parties in the supply chain try to avoid bearing the cost. Businesses are feeling the squeeze, with toy maker Hasbro cutting 3% of its workforce due to higher Chinese import tariffs. And Japanese automaker Mitsubishi raising U.S. vehicle prices by an average of 2.1%. Retail chain At Home even cited tariff volatility as a central factor in its recent bankruptcy filing. Globally, the UN Trade Agency warned of a worsening decline in investment, and a Bain & Company study predicted a slowdown in luxury sales. Meanwhile, U.S. consumers are growing more pessimistic about rising prices, according to TransUnion, and the tourism industry is observing foreign visitors choosing alternative destinations due to trade tensions. Legal challenges are also mounting, with two family-owned businesses asking the Supreme Court to consider striking down the president's most sweeping tariffs. Domestically, the administration's narrative control and response to civil unrest have drawn significant scrutiny, notably in the wake of the recent Los Angeles protests against federal immigration raids. The Jerusalem Post on June 19, 2025, detailed how the Trump administration and its allies have portrayed Los Angeles as a terrifying hellscape, with images of burning Waymo vehicles and masked protesters dominating conservative media. This portrayal, critics argue, starkly contrasts with the reality for most Angelenos and serves a political agenda. UCLA political science professor Lynn Vavreck noted that such events are calcified along predictable partisan lines, with both sides seeking to build very different worlds. President Trump in a Truth Social post exaggerated the scale of destruction, claiming that without his military intervention, Los Angeles would be burning just like it was burning a number of months ago, with all the houses that were lost. This hyperbole was echoed by congressional allies and even Veterans Affairs Secretary Douglas Collins, who linked the protests to disruptions in veterans' healthcare. However, local officials and many residents pushed back, with Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass condemning vandalism and looting while emphasizing that anyone who vandalized downtown or looted stores does not care about our immigrant communities. The controversial deployment of the National Guard and U.S. Marines by the president without California Governor Gavin Newsom's approval was widely criticized, with even former mayoral opponent Rick Caruso stating there is no emergency, widespread threat, or out-of-control violence in Los Angeles, and absolutely no danger that justifies deployment of the National Guard, military, or other federal force. Experts like journalist Craig Silverman highlighted the challenge of providing context when social platforms incentivize the most shocking videos and claims. Finally, the ongoing saga of TikTok's fate in the U.S. exemplifies the complex interplay of national security, economic interests, and political maneuvering. PennLive.com reported on June 19, 2025, that President Trump has once again delayed a potential ban on TikTok, signing an executive order to keep the platform running for another 90 days. This marks the third extension, creating what e-marketer analyst Jeremy Goldman calls deadline purgatory, resembling a recurring threat with no real resolution. Despite earlier national security concerns that led to a brief ban and a Supreme Court upholding of a congressional ban, Trump's personal affinity for the platform, where he has amassed over 15 million followers and credits it with helping him gain traction among young voters, appears to be a significant factor. While the administration continues to seek a deal for American ownership, China's prior withdrawal from negotiations following tariff announcements complicated matters. The repeated delays also raise questions about the legal basis for such extensions, though no challenges have yet materialized. Public opinion on a TikTok ban remains divided, with a recent Pew Research Center survey finding only about one-third of Americans supporting a ban, down from 50% in March 2023, largely due to data security concerns. Senator Mark Warner, vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, criticized the administration for flouting the law and ignoring its own national security findings. For now, TikTok continues to serve its 170 million US users, with tech giants like Apple, Google, and Oracle persuaded to support the app under assurances from the Justice Department. As these interconnected narratives unfold, they paint a vivid picture of an administration that frequently leverages digital platforms for direct communication, employs aggressive economic pressure as a primary foreign policy tool, and actively shapes domestic perceptions through strategic rhetoric. The coming months will undoubtedly witness continued negotiations on trade, further legal battles over executive authority, and an ongoing debate about the responsible use of power in the digital age. All while the global community navigates the implications of an increasingly unpredictable and interconnected world, the global stage and domestic policy landscape are currently gripped by a whirlwind of high-stakes decisions and shifting political tides as the current administration navigates a complex tapestry of international conflicts, technological dilemmas, and critical economic challenges. From the immediate threat of escalating conflict in the Middle East to the intricate dance of digital regulation and the long-term solvency of national programs, the implications of these developments resonate deeply across all sectors. At the forefront of global concerns is the rapidly intensifying conflict between Israel and Iran, which has seen a brutal week of exchanges claiming at least 240 Iranian and 24 Israeli lives since June 13. Israeli warplanes struck 3 nuclear sites in Iran on June 18 following an Iranian ballistic missile attack that damaged Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. An act Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to exact the full price for. Iran, for its part, asserted its forces would continue to pummel the criminals who target our people until they cease and pay for their criminal aggression, while claiming the hospital damage was collateral from a strike on a nearby military command center, a claim Israel denies. Amid this escalating violence, President Donald Trump has indicated a substantial chance of U.S. negotiations with Iran, stating he would decide within 2 weeks whether diplomacy could avert direct American military involvement in Israel's campaign against Tehran's nuclear program. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, quoting the president, emphasized that Iran would need to agree to stop all uranium enrichment for any agreement to be acceptable, reinforcing that Iran is absolutely not able to achieve a nuclear weapon. The prospect of direct U.S. intervention carries significant risks, highlighted by concerns over the approximately 40,000 U.S. troops stationed across the Middle East who could face Iranian ballistic missile drone or terrorist counterattacks. A Wall Street Journal report on June 18 suggesting Trump had green-lighted strike plans pending Iran's nuclear enrichment concessions was swiftly disparaged by the president on Truth Social. The Wall Street Journal has no idea what my thoughts are concerning Iran. This uncertainty is further compounded by Israel's shifting rhetoric, with Defense Minister Israel Katz openly advocating for intensified strikes to destabilize the Ayatollah regime and calling Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei the modern Hitler. While Prime Minister Netanyahu is mused about regime change, Foreign Minister Gideon Saar stated it was not an official goal for the time being, emphasizing that the matter rests first and foremost a matter for the Iranian people. Meanwhile, Pakistan has voiced deep concerns that a collapse of authority in Iran could energize separatist and jihadist militants along their shared border, and worries about the precedent of attacking another country's nuclear installations, particularly after its own recent conflict with nuclear-armed rival India. The ongoing conflict has spurred a mass exodus, with foreign governments including the US, Australia, Austria, China, France, Germany, India, Italy, and Japan actively evacuating their citizens from both Israel and Iran. Despite the diplomatic tightrope, former White House strategist Steve Bannon posited that the vast majority of Trump's MAGA movement would ultimately support military action against Iran should diplomacy fail. Economically, Iran continues to maintain its crude oil supply, utilizing a shadow fleet of tankers and moving its floating storage closer to China to mitigate disruptions, with analytics firm Plur reporting a 5-week high of 2.2 million barrels per day loaded this week. This resilience underscores Iran's determination to sustain a critical revenue source despite targeted attacks on energy infrastructure, including Israel's Haifa oil refinery and Iran's South Pars gas field. On the domestic front, the administration is making waves with significant policy shifts affecting technology, immigration, gun control, and social safety nets. In a move that continues to test the limits of presidential power, President Trump has once again extended the deadline for TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to find a buyer for its U.S. operations now until September 17. This marks the third extension since a 2024 law mandated the app's sale or ban due to national security concerns over Chinese access to American user data and potential propaganda dissemination. With over 170 million U.S. users, TikTok expressed gratitude for the president's leadership and support as the company continues to work with Vice President J.D. Vance on a potential deal, one that was previously complicated by new tariffs on Chinese imports. Simultaneously, the Department of Homeland Security has imposed new limits on congressional oversight visits to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement (ICE) facilities, denying unannounced access to field offices under operational concerns. This policy comes amidst high-profile clashes with Democratic lawmakers in California, Illinois, and New York being denied entry, and incidents like Representative LaMonica McIver being charged with assault and Senator Alex Padilla being handcuffed during attempts to question officials. Representative Benny Thompson, top Democrat on the Homeland Security Committee, condemned the new guidance as an affront to the Constitution and federal law, arguing it serves as a smokescreen to conceal the holding of migrants and sometimes U.S. citizens for days without legal access. Adding to immigration concerns, the State Department plans to review the social media accounts of foreign citizens applying for student and visiting scholar visas for hostility toward the United States, requiring accounts to be made public. This new policy, which led to a month-long halt in processing these visas, has drawn criticism for potentially stifling free speech and promoting ideological conformity, especially given Secretary of State Marco Rubio's previous actions, including revoking hundreds of visas and targeting Chinese students with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. The Justice Department is also set to dramatically reduce the number of inspectors monitoring federally licensed gun dealers, slashing two-thirds of the estimated 800 investigators. This move, part of the administration's broader effort to downsize and defund the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives (ATF) and potentially merge it with the Drug Enforcement Administration, is expected to cut the ATF's regulatory capacity by approximately 40%. Critics, including John Feinblatt of Everytown for Gun Safety, warn these are devastating cuts that will undermine the ATF's ability to combat gun violence and benefit unscrupulous gun dealers. The plan follows a rollback of Biden-era regulations concerning homemade firearms, pistol braces, and private gun sale background checks, leaving the agency's workforce reeling and raising significant public safety concerns. Finally, the nation faces a looming crisis in its social safety nets. The Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is now projected to be depleted by 2033, 9 months earlier than previously estimated, meaning benefits could be reduced by 23% if Congress fails to act. This deterioration is partly attributed to the recent Social Security Fairness Act and evolving demographic and economic assumptions. Medicare's Hospital Care Trust Fund also faces a similar 2033 depletion date. While trustees urge timely gradual changes, the report does not fully reflect the potential impact of the administration's policies such as tariffs and mass deportations, which analysts suggest could worsen deficits. Despite the president's vow to protect these programs, the involvement of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency (DOGE) and aggressive federal job cuts at the Social Security Administration has been criticized for causing chaos without addressing the core financing challenges. Experts like Jason Fichtner stress that focusing solely on fraud and waste is misleading at best and dishonest at worst for a program with already low overhead costs. Beyond these critical policy shifts, the political landscape continues to evolve. Senator Bernie Sanders' independent Vermont has injected national attention into a key House battleground by endorsing Democrat Rebecca Cook for Congress in Wisconsin's 3rd District. Cook, who lost by less than 3 points in 2024 despite Trump carrying the district by 7 points, represents a notable cross-section of Democratic support, having also been endorsed by the moderate Blue Dog Democrats PAC. Sanders praised Cook as a working-class fighter who was ready to deliver tangible outcomes that working people will actually feel, highlighting the Democratic Party's ongoing debate on policy platforms and voter coalitions post-2024. As the administration prepares for a NATO summit in The Hague aiming to keep President Trump happy, allies have already diluted their public support for Ukrainian membership and are considering widening the definition of military spending to meet Trump's demand for 5% of GDP. This shell game, as some experts describe it, reflects the complex diplomatic efforts to manage a demanding U.S. stance while addressing real security concerns posed by a militarized Russia. The confluence of these dynamic situations, a volatile geopolitical environment, a transformative domestic policy agenda impacting technology, individual freedoms, public safety and economic security, and an evolving political narrative underscores an era of profound change and uncertainty. The coming months will undoubtedly test the resilience of institutions, the adaptability of policy, and the patience of populations as the world watches how these intricate threads weave into the fabric of future developments. As the clock ticks relentlessly towards the critical July 9 deadline, President Trump's self-imposed tariff pause is poised to expire, setting the stage for a dramatic escalation of global trade tensions, fresh from the G7 summit in Canada where trade was unequivocally front and center. The administration's aggressive posture on international commerce continues to reshape economic landscapes worldwide, leaving businesses, consumers, and even central banks grappling with unprecedented uncertainty. At the G7, President Trump secured a limited albeit significant trade agreement with the United Kingdom signed with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This deal, lowering tariffs on British car and aerospace imports and offering an annual quota of 100,000 vehicles at a reduced 10% tariff, offers a glimmer of a pathway forward for some. However, the president's pronouncements following the summit painted a stark picture for other major economies. He characterized Japan as tough in negotiations and expressed dissatisfaction with the European Union, stating, "They're either going to make a good deal or they'll just pay whatever we say they have to pay." This aggressive stance underscores his "I'm a tariff person" philosophy, which has dominated his first 5 months in office. Indeed, the European Union now appears increasingly resigned to a 10% reciprocal tariff as the baseline for any US-EU trade deal, a figure negotiators are still trying to push lower, according to sources close to the talks. The FT reports that the EU is also exploring a UK-style trade deal, hoping to allow some tariffs to remain after the July 9 deadline and prevent further retaliation. This comes as the EU's trade surplus with the US has paradoxically expanded each month since January, despite existing tariffs reaching an approximate $115 billion deficit for the US in April. Meanwhile, Japan, whose Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba failed to secure a trade deal with Trump at the G7, faces deepening economic anxieties, with US tariffs already impacting its auto industry. A Reuters survey indicates over 70% of Japanese firms expect the business impact of US tariffs to be as anticipated without adjusting their investment plans. Yet the lack of a deal could further jeopardize Ishiba's political future. Beyond these major players, nations like South Korea have launched task forces to navigate U.S. trade negotiations, and Thailand's commerce minister remains confident of negotiating tariffs as low as 10%. The broader tech fight also continues to widen, with Taiwan blacklisting Huawei and the U.S. reportedly pushing Vietnam to decouple from Chinese tech, while a recent U.S.-China truce left critical military use rare earth issues unresolved. Domestically, the ripple effects of these trade policies are becoming increasingly tangible. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, facing unrelenting pressure from President Trump to slash interest rates, has maintained a wait-and-see approach, emphasizing the need for more data to understand the very uncertain pass-through of tariffs to consumer price inflation. Powell noted that Fed officials' estimates for core personal consumption expenditures (PCE) for 2025 have moved higher, acknowledging that substantially larger tariffs were coming and that would mean higher inflation. This positions the Fed on a collision course with the White House as the central bank anticipates a stagflationary shock, simultaneously rising inflation and unemployment, a scenario that complicates its dual mandate. While some like JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon sound cautiously optimistic that tariffs might only make a soft landing a little bit softer, others are already feeling the pinch. For American businesses and consumers, the impact is already evident. Home goods retailer At Home recently filed for bankruptcy, explicitly blaming tariffs for intensifying its financial struggles, particularly the uncertainty around key holiday orders. Hasbro, the maker of Monopoly, announced a 3% workforce reduction due to higher U.S. tariffs on toys from China. Mitsubishi Motors is raising U.S. vehicle prices by an average of 2.1%, passing tariff costs directly to consumers. Though the broader auto market has yet to see widespread price increases from tariffs that began in April. The aerospace industry, a net exporter for the U.S., is lobbying to return to a 1979 zero-tariff agreement, as 10% tariffs on imported planes and parts weigh on the sector, contributing to macroeconomic uncertainty that has even led JetBlue to cut flights. Even smaller amusement parks are bracing for a tough summer as families wary of economic uncertainty opt to stay home. Global sales of personal luxury goods are expected to slow, and the UN trade agency warns of a worsening global investment decline. The looming August 12 deadline for Chinese goods has also triggered shipping chaos as companies race against time to get products into the U.S. before higher duties resume. Politically, President Trump's tariff policy, though controversial, appears to resonate with a significant portion of the electorate. A recent Stack Data Strategy megapoll, first reported by Politico Playbook, found that a plurality of American voters support Trump's economic approach, and remarkably, nearly a quarter of Democratic voters, particularly minorities 24%, Hispanic 27%, Black 30%, Asian, are more inclined to support House GOP candidates in the 2026 midterms due to his trade-focused policies. While overall approval of Trump's economic handling stands at 35%, with 41% disapproval, a considerable 42% of voters believe economic turbulence could be worth it in the long run. This sentiment, coupled with strong approval for his immigration policy and key provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, such as extending 2017 tax cuts and boosting border security funding, suggests a complex interplay of public opinion that could influence future elections. The president's continued public attacks on Fed Chair Powell, whom he has called stupid and a real dummy, highlight the deep ideological divide over economic policy, especially given the rising national debt, which nonpartisan analysts project could increase by over $3 trillion within a decade due to proposed tax cuts. As the July 9 deadline approaches, the global economy stands at a precipice. The intricate dance between presidential trade ambitions, central bank caution, and the real-world impacts on businesses and consumers will continue to define the immediate future. The outcome of ongoing negotiations, the Supreme Court's potential intervention on tariff legality, and the Fed's eventual policy adjustments will shape not only economic indicators but also the political landscape, setting the stage for a tumultuous period of adaptation and realignment in international trade. As geopolitical tensions simmer on the global stage, particularly concerning the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran, the Trump administration finds itself at a critical juncture, weighing potential military intervention while simultaneously navigating significant domestic policy shifts that are reshaping the landscape of scientific research. This multifaceted approach underscores a presidency characterized by a reliance on direct, often unconventional decision-making and a willingness to challenge established norms both internationally and within the nation's institutional frameworks. At the forefront of the administration's immediate concerns is the volatile situation in the Middle East, where President Donald Trump is deliberating whether the United States will join Israel's ongoing strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. With Israel already bombarding Iranian sites, Trump has held multiple high-level Situation Room meetings, publicly stating his indecision. "I may do it, I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do." He claimed that Iran is now seeking negotiations at the White House, though Tehran's mission to the United Nations swiftly denied this, asserting no Iranian official has ever asked to grovel at the gates of the White House. Despite previously favoring a diplomatic resolution, Trump has moved to back the key U.S. ally, maintaining daily contact with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and reportedly telling him to keep going with the offensive. Insiders suggest Trump, who believes Iran is weeks away from developing a nuclear bomb and possesses the unique bunker buster capability, is holding off on approved attack plans to see if Iran will concede on its nuclear program. His decision-making style, described by the Washington Post as relying on experience over star power, appears to prioritize gut instinct and military brass over traditional cabinet counsel, particularly as he noted, "I like to make the final decision 1 second before it's due. Because things change. Especially with war." This high-stakes foreign policy deliberation has cast a spotlight on the internal dynamics of the Trump administration, revealing a tightly knit circle of advisors and a notable exclusion of key officials. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, despite being confirmed earlier this year, has reportedly been frozen out of high-level discussions regarding Iran. According to an official, nobody is talking to Hegseth, with other sources confirming a complete lack of operational interface between Hegseth's office and the White House. This marginalization reportedly stems in part from Signalgate, an incident where Hegseth allegedly shared sensitive intelligence in a group chat that mistakenly included a journalist. Instead, a Tier 1 group comprising Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and Joint Chiefs Chair General Dan Kane has emerged as the president's primary military and intelligence counselors. Even Tulsi Gabbard, who leads the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, has reportedly fallen out of favor after a recent video warning of nuclear conflict angered the president, further illustrating a tightening of the advisory circle around Trump. Concurrently, the Trump administration has been aggressively pursuing a significant domestic policy shift targeting how federal agencies fund academic research. Since the start of President Trump's second term, at least 4 federal agencies have moved to cap reimbursement for colleges' indirect research costs, expenses like laboratory maintenance, utilities, and administrative support, to a mere 15%. The National Institutes of Health (NIH), U.S. Department of Energy, National Science Foundation (NSF), and U.S. Department of Defense (DoD) have all attempted to implement these caps, citing cost savings and a desire to ensure funding directly supports scientific research rather than administrative costs and facility upgrades, as stated by U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, in a separate memo, estimated the DoD's cap alone would save the agency $900 million annually. These moves have triggered a wave of legal challenges from universities, state attorneys general, and higher education groups who argue that such caps would devastate scientific research, harm the nation's research, and inflict a serious financial blow on colleges. Many institutions currently have negotiated reimbursement rates for indirect costs well above 50%, meaning a 15% cap could result in the loss of tens of millions of dollars. So far, the courts have largely sided with the universities. U.S. District Judge Angel Kelly permanently blocked NIH's 15% cap, ruling that the agency failed to follow proper regulatory procedures and applied the policy retroactively. Although the Trump administration has appealed this ruling, it marked the first judicial blow against these caps. Similarly, U.S. District Judge Allison Burroughs granted a preliminary injunction blocking the Energy Department's cap, finding that plaintiffs were likely to prove the limit violates federal law. The NSF voluntarily delayed its policy's effective date until a federal judge issues a ruling following a recent hearing. Most recently, U.S. District Judge Brian Murphy issued a temporary restraining order blocking the Defense Department's policy, which had ambitiously sought to renegotiate and even terminate existing grants that didn't conform to the new terms. The lawsuits collectively warned that if allowed to stand, these policies would stop critical research in its tracks, lead to layoffs and cutbacks at universities across the country, badly undermine scientific research, and erode our nation's enviable status as a global leader in scientific research and innovation. As the Trump administration navigates the treacherous waters of international conflict and reshapes domestic policy, a consistent theme emerges: a centralized decision-making process often outside traditional channels and a willingness to confront established institutions.
The future of U.S. involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict remains uncertain, hanging on the president's 1 second before it's due decision-making.
Simultaneously, the fate of billions of dollars in research funding and the nation's scientific competitiveness hinges on ongoing legal battles with the administration's appeals and future court dates promising continued turbulence for the higher education and research sectors. The coming weeks are poised to be pivotal, defining both the trajectory of American foreign policy and the foundational support for its scientific enterprise. The Middle East simmers on the brink of wider conflict as the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran threaten to draw global powers into a perilous new phase of confrontation. At the heart of the crisis lies Iran's controversial nuclear program, with the international community holding its breath as U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly weighs a decision to join Israeli strikes, while UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer urgently champions diplomacy to avert a full-blown regional war. The immediate flashpoint remains the intense exchange of fire between Israel and Iran, with Tel Aviv asserting its actions are aimed at preventing Tehran from developing a nuclear weapon, a threat it deems imminent and existential. However, Iran vehemently denies these claims, insisting its nuclear program is peaceful and blaming Israel for initiating the current hostilities. The International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) has confirmed that Iran has amassed uranium enriched to 60% purity, a mere short technical step from weapons-grade 90%, raising alarms among Western powers. Amidst this backdrop, the Fordow nuclear enrichment plant, an underground facility believed to be highly fortified, has emerged as a critical target. The prospect of direct U.S. military intervention looms large, with CBS, the BBC's U.S. partner, reporting that President Trump has approved attack plans, though a final decision remains elusive. The Atlantic Council, a prominent think tank, has weighed in on Trump's complex calculus, suggesting that if diplomatic avenues and Israel's independent efforts fall short, the U.S. should consider bombing Fordow and other remaining nuclear infrastructure. This proposed action, however, comes with a crucial caveat: Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu must declare objectives accomplished and end the war, explicitly ruling out regime change. Such a move would undoubtedly face considerable opposition within the Trump administration and the Make America Great Again movement, who might argue it bogs down the U.S. and the region, diverts focus from China, and contradicts Trump's previous pledges against foreign entanglements. Yet proponents argue that the proposal is not for a multi-year war or boots on the ground, but a targeted strike to neutralize a critical threat, emphasizing the Middle East's enduring importance to global commerce. The risks of U.S. intervention are palpable and severe. An expanded conflict could lead to retaliatory strikes against U.S. forces and interests in the region, as well as against key Arab partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have recently sought rapprochement with Tehran after years of hardline policies. These nations hosting U.S. bases fear being targeted, which could send oil prices soaring and create societal instability. However, analysts suggest these risks must be weighed against Iran's already weakened state and the regime's overriding goal of survival, which could lead to proportionally limited responses, much like the aftermath of the 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. The ultimate question for U.S. policymakers, according to Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council, is whether the United States is better off with an Iran that remains on the cusp of nuclear weapon capability, or one whose program is effectively dismantled. Disabling Iran's nuclear program is seen as crucial for regional stability, potentially paving the way for a two-state solution and fostering economic partnerships, particularly with Gulf nations. A key focus of Trump's foreign policy. Across the Atlantic, the UK finds itself grappling with its potential role in any US-led action. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has been unequivocal in his call for further negotiations rather than an escalation of the conflict, stressing that the nuclear issue needs to be dealt with, but it is better dealt with by way of negotiation than by way of conflict. He reiterated the government's commitment to de-escalation, acknowledging Israel's right to self-defense while expressing deep concern over Iran's nuclear program. This stance contrasts sharply with calls from prominent conservatives. Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel and former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt have urged the UK government to back the US, even suggesting the use of British bases such as Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. for operations involving B-2 stealth bombers to target facilities like Fordow. Dame Preeti emphasized the importance of working with our allies, working alongside the US and Israel to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and their ballistic missile capabilities, which are a threat to us in the UK. However, this potential involvement is complicated by significant legal concerns.
Britain's top legal advisor Lord Hermer has reportedly raised questions over the lawfulness of Israel's actions in Iran, which could restrict the UK government's ability to support any US action, potentially limiting it to defensive support.
While a senior government source suggested the situation is not as simple as that, Dame Preeti argued the UK cannot hide behind legal advice at a time of crisis. Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey conversely has demanded the publication of any legal advice. Fearing the UK being dragged into another illegal war in the Middle East by the US. Emily Thornberry, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, a Labour MP, has stated it is not justifiable for the UK to get involved, advocating for a parliamentary vote before any military action and asserting a position not to obstruct but not to actively assist the US.
Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue in parallel.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy is in Washington to meet his U.S. counterpart Marco Rubio, a meeting initially scheduled after Lammy chaired discussions with Iranian and EU representatives regarding Iran's nuclear program escalation. The pair are expected to address a recent disagreement over the UK's decision to sanction two far-right Israeli cabinet ministers alongside France, Germany, Canada, and Australia.
Lammy will then travel to Geneva for further talks with EU, German, French, and Iranian counterparts.
With Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi maintaining his country's commitment to diplomacy. Amidst these high-stakes discussions, the Foreign Office is also preparing for the potential evacuation of British nationals from Tel Aviv once airspace reopens for non-military flights, reflecting the immediate human impact of the ongoing hostilities.
The coming days and weeks will be pivotal. The future of the Middle East hinges on the answer to a singular overarching question: will Iran's nuclear program be contained through negotiation or by force?
The decisions made by Washington, London, and Tehran will not only determine the trajectory of this volatile region but also cast a long shadow over global energy markets, international alliances, and the very architecture of peace and security for years to come.